You all have 1 o'clock. What time do you have?
Yeah, I got 1 o'clock.
I got 101.
Okay, then you better start. Wow, 4?
Ada wasn't in the 8 a.m. for
No, he
Friday.
wasn't in our classes this
Oh,
morning.
he wasn't?
He says he has something going on in Norfolk.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what it
I know that Dalton told me he's dealing with car issues or car trouble.
We'll get him.
I don't know where everyone else is.
What else we have?
I think Shalene might be in quarantine because Libby said that she was in.
Oh.
was. He's
Yeah.
getting
Yeah,
busy.
I know Libby's in quarantine. She wasn't here at the 11 o'clock class. But I haven't received an email about that from the schools.
And Noah wasn't in choir, so.
I haven't seen Joey today at all. He wasn't saying that.
Okay.
I just figured Glenn was in quarantine because him and Libby always hang out.
Yeah, that would probably be a fair assumption. I can see that's a logical deduction. All right, well, let's get started today. Those of you that are here, I will return their graded assignments that I got over the weekend, so take care of that first.
Awesome.
And then let's get into what we need to get into today.
Yep.
I got one from prior week for you.
Y'all have big plans for Thanksgiving?
I need to decide which side of the family I'm going to go. I'm going to go with this.
That's the move.
Excited to see it. Like, the big one that was just born yesterday.
Oh, that's awesome.
Very excited.
All right, well, thanks for being here. Dr. Armstrong had borrowed the video camera for the 11 o'clock class, so I couldn't record Theory 1 then. So if you guys weren't here, I'd have to just do it by myself and just record myself. So, but you know, I actually did a little bit of that last spring. You guys, yeah, well, you were here last spring, but yeah, because, you know, there was no students on campus. Well, I mean, yeah, there were no classes the second half of last spring, so I had to come down here and record things on my own. Well, whatever. Okay, so if you talk to anyone from the 11 a.m. section of theory today, I was fine with either collecting the homework or not collecting the homework, and the majority of them voted for me not to collect it. So I'm not going to be collecting the homework today, just to be fair across the board. So what I will be doing though is we will be covering the answers, and I'll be showing them up on the TV to make sure that you are getting your few non-chord tones correctly, the analysis of your Roman numerals correct, and also your part writing correctly. So the TV was working for me earlier today, so I'm assuming it should work again. I don't see why it shouldn't. Oh, but I have in my notes that 1, 2, 3. I'm taking a grade on at least the next 3 assignments, and that's going to get us pretty close to the end of the semester.
Oh, goodness.
That's right, we only have 2 weeks left, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just got to hang in there for a few more days.
Is that 2 weeks counting finals?
Well, if we count finals, maybe it's 2 1/3 or 2.5 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks and change.
I was still told 2.5
You're what? You're excited?
now. Told 2.5.
Oh, it's all 2.5, okay. I'm so excited that it's only 2.5 weeks.
I know. I can't wait to get rid of myself either.
All right, okay, so let's take out your handout if you don't have it out already and look at the first section. You will recall last class, or last week, that I talked about 2 non-chord tone types, the passing tone and the neighbor tone. And I described how, first of all, both of those have to not be part of the chord. In other words, they don't belong into the harmony in which they're found. And once you find a pitch that's not part of the harmony, then you look to see how that note is approached and left. Passing tones are approached by step, and they're left by a step in the same direction. Neighbor tones are approached by step, but they're left by step in the opposite direction. Okay? And you only have to look at the notes surrounding the non-chord tone in the same voice that the non-chord tone is located. So for instance, in the pickup measure, I found two passing tones, one in the soprano voice, one in the tenor voice. I can tell that this is for sure a passing tone. Number one, it's not part of the A, C sharp, E harmony, because it's a B, it doesn't fit. So I put parentheses around it, and I can see that just in the soprano voice, just the upstem notes, I can see that the B is approached by step and left by step in the same direction. So that makes it a passing tone. Okay? I don't have to look at the alto voice or any other pitches to try to confuse myself as to how the note is approached and left. It's just the voice, the sole voice in which the note is found. Okay. If you keep going, you can see that in the first full measure, I found a neighbor tone in the alto voice on beat 1. Then on beat 3, there's a passing tone in the tenor voice. And then on beat 4, there's a neighbor tone in the alto voice. Finally, in the last measure, there are a couple passing tones, one in the bass voice and one in the tenor voice. Okay. And if you have questions about those, please let me know. If you don't understand how I got them or how I found them, why I'm labeling them the way I'm labeling them, that kind of thing, please do let me know. Now, this particular non-chord tone on beat 4 of the first full measure, I put parentheses around that for you because the notes that are found on beat 4, you could assume or you could include the F sharp and think of it as a chord tone, and if you did, it would be a B, D, F sharp chord. But you can also think of the next alto note, a G sharp, as the chord tone as well. In that case, it would be a G sharp, B, D chord. And I wanted to make it clear to you that the F sharp was not part of the chord and that the G sharp is part of the chord. And so when you count the G sharp, but not the F sharp, G sharp, B, D, you're going to get this Roman numeral, hopefully, for that beat, a 7 diminished 6. 7 diminished 6. You can see the remaining Roman numerals that you should have. Obviously, we don't take the non-chord tones into account, but the chord tones we do. So there's a 1 followed by another 1, then a 4 chord in first inversion, followed by 5 in root position, the 7 diminished 6, the 1 in first inversion, followed by root position 5 and 1. Okay? And I think that covers everything in the example. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that before we go on to the next section? Well, actually what I'd like to do is I'm going to take this and go over to the piano and I'm going to play this so you can hear what you have analyzed. We're in A major. But I kind of like the sound of the 9 chord tones in there. It makes each of the lines that they're found in, it makes them a little more melodic. It gives them a little more shape. It gives them a little more pitch variety. And it makes it sound more like real or actual music rather than just block chord after block chord after block chord. Okay? And for any of you that are in any kind of choir, I'm sure that you sing passing tones and neighbor tones, and you may not just not be realizing it if you're singing those. All right, moving on to the next section, the part writing. Now, your inner voices, when I'm showing the answers to the part writing, your inner voices do not have to be exactly like mine, and they can still be correct. Okay? The soprano I gave you, so that should be identical. The bass notes, I would think they're going to be pretty close to mine. They might be just an octave away from one of my bass notes, but the pitches should still be the same. So this is how I part wrote the example. And I do want to make some comments about the second or the middle measure in particular. But just take a look at what I have and compare it to what you have. Again, the soprano should be identical. The bass should be pretty close to what I have, unless you just put one of the notes in a different octave, which I think would be fine, as long as you don't cross the tenor. I think I gave you blanks to put in the numbers for the guidelines that you used to part write the root position chords whose roots are fourth or fifth apart. And, well, then I wanted to make a comment about the middle measure I said. Okay, so, last class, I talked to you, we learned how to part write a second inversion triad. The only second inversion triad that I want you to be using right now, and the only one we will see for the rest of the semester, is the second inversion triad on scale degree 1, otherwise known as the 1-6-4 chord. Do you remember what I told you you should double in any second inversion triad?
The third.
Not exactly the third. You're going to double the fifth of the chord. The fifth of the chord, which is the same thing as saying you want to double the bass note of all second inversion triads. So if you have a chord with the number 6-4 next to it, second inversion, that means you want to double the bass note or double the fifth of the chord. It means the same thing. So hopefully you can see here that in my B flat D F chord, in second inversion, the F is in the bass, and you see how I have another F as well. Mine's in the alto, but yours could be in the tenor if you part wrote it that way. Then I had asked you to take that double pitch, the bass note, and just keep those two double notes static. So my F just slides over in the bass, and my F in the other voice just slides over. I don't raise or lower those pitches, just leave them on the same notes as they go to the next chord. Then the remaining part of part writing this 1-6-4 to 5 means you take the two other voices that you have left and you move them down by step. Each one down by step. So my D in the soprano goes down by step to C, and my B flat in the tenor goes down by step to A. And that should give you, following those guidelines, that should give you all the notes you need in both the 1-6-4 and also the root position 5 chord. Should be done just like that because that is the smoothest way to go from a 1-6-4 to a 5. There's no smoother way to do that. Let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to mention to you? Yeah, I guess I could mention that all the chords in this example, you wanted to double the note that was in the bass. Because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the 8 chords are root position, and we always double the root or the bass note in root position triads. The 1-6-4 chord, as I just finished saying, we double the bass note in that chord as well. So whatever pitch is in the bass, that's the note that you should be doubling in every triad we've talked about so far in part writing. And, excuse me. We'll learn a couple more different inversions of triads today where we're going to have slightly different doubling rules. But for now, doubling should be pretty easy. So, let me know, does anyone have any questions or comments about this? I did have some students in my 11 a.m. section. They kind of had, like in the first measure, for instance, they had what I have in the alto, they had an octave lower in the tenor, and what I have in the tenor, they had put in the alto, but I think that should be fine. Again, there's more than one way to part write some of these inner voices sometimes and still get decent, correct part writing. So that should be okay. Let me go to the piano and play this. You can hear how this sounds. Okay, we're in B flat major. No non-chord tones in this example, just block chords. Are we good with this? can go ahead and tuck that away, put that away for now. We can go on to our new material for the day. Like I said, I will be taking grades on the next 3 assignments, and that's going to get us at least into next week. And then by next week, the middle of next week, we probably need to start thinking about reviewing for the final test or the final exam already. So. Okay. Now, so far, we have learned how to part write any root position chords in any relationship. Okay? So the root position chords, as far as my mind is concerned, they're covered, right? We talked about all the possibilities of going from one root position chord to another, and we know how to part write that situation. Last class, we also talked about how to part write one second inversion triad, and that is the 1-6-4 chord, or the second inversion chord on scale degree 1. And that's the only second inversion triad we're going to be dealing with, again, until we get probably partway through next semester. Okay? So that's the only second inversion triad you need to be concerned about. So I think now it's appropriate that we start learning how to part write some first inversion triads, because that's the only inversion left. There are, well, before I guess let's start getting into first inversion chords like this. On page 114 in your textbook, chapter 8 is where I'm getting into, and I'll put this up on the screen. This is page 114, it's the first page of chapter 8 in your book. And I just want to put these 2 examples up on the screen, because I first want to talk about, well, why do composers use first inversion triads in music anyways? You know, why can't all of music be all root position chords? Or why can't all of music be all root position and just second inversion chords? Well, there's a reason, there's a couple main reasons why composers use first inversion triads in the first place. And I'm going to play these 2 examples kind of back to back, so your ear can tell you maybe why, some of the reasons why first inversion chords are used. So let me start with example 8-1. This is on the top of page 114. And, well, it doesn't sound bad, but just listen to the bass line especially. Doesn't sound bad at all. Sounds like decent music. If I play the bass line by itself, it goes like this. Not bad of a bass line either. We know that bass lines can leap around quite a bit, especially compared to the top 3 voices in the texture. But I would say that this bass line is a little bit angular. It's a little bit disjunct. It's a little bit repetitive. It's a little bit rigid. In fact, I don't know if you can see the Roman numerals on the screen, but every single harmony in this short passage is in root position. Root position. There are no inverted chords at all. Now, let me play example H2 for you and see what your ears tell you. Which example do you like the sound of better?
The second one.
Oh, the second one. I would agree with you. And the reason I would agree with you is largely because the second example uses some triads in first inversion, some chords in first inversion. In fact, if you look at the screen there are 3 chords that are in first inversion. They're all highlighted in green. Now, what do the first inversion chords do to the bass line in particular? Well, let me play the bass line of example 8-2 by itself. There are 2 reasons why I like this bass line and the overall sound example 8-2 better than the first example. The three first inversion chords in example 8-2 give the music this. First of all, they give the bass line a more interesting contour or shape. It's not as strict, it's not as rigid, it's not as repetitive as the bass line in example 8-1. The second reason I like example 8-2 better is because the bass line has a greater variety of pitches than the bass line does in the first example. And these are the two main reasons I think why composers use first inversion chords in their music, in their compositions in the first place. Right? Because number one, we have a more interesting shape, or there's a more interesting contour to the bass line in the bottom example than there is in the top example. And we have a greater variety of pitches. The bass gets to go from D to F sharp, it gets C sharp in the middle measure, it gets G in the second to last measure, where it doesn't have any of those pitches in the top example. The top example is just all D, A, E, and that's it. Those are the only notes that the bass gets, and there's only one E in the whole thing. So that's kind of a little explanation of why first inversion chords are even used in music in the first place. They can really smooth out the bass line, and if you are a bass singer, which I know you are, Matthew, then you actually have more variety of pitches. Your lines are more singable, they're a little less choppy, they're a little less disjunct, that kind of thing. They're more melodic, I guess I should say. Okay. Now, this does not mean that a musical passage without inverted chords is poorly composed. It just depends on what effect the composer is after. And just so you know, the bottom example here, example 8-2, that is the first four measures of a piano sonata written by Haydn. The top example is not written by Haydn. The top example was the bass line was rearranged or notated by the author of the text in order to create all those root position chords. Okay? Now, I've said, I don't know if I've probably said this to my students before, but sometimes when you hear a passage by this composer, you can't really tell who the composer is. And do you know why? Because the composer is Haydn. Get it? Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Let's move on. I've listed here on the board all of the possible triads that we can write and use in first inversion. That is a first inversion chord on each scale degree. On each scale degree. Now, out of all of these first inversion triads on scale degrees 1 through 7, I want you to know that there are two triads in first inversion that are rarely used in music at all. And for that reason, I don't even want you to be analyzing chords in that inversion, and I don't want you to be writing or part writing chords in that inversion. Excuse me. And you can see which of these two first inversion triads are hardly ever used and ones I want you to avoid from now on. And that is the first inversion 3 chord and the first inversion 6 chord. These triads are so rare in that inversion, they're basically useless triads. They don't have great impact. Their sound is weak, and they're hardly ever used in music for that reason. So we're just not going to deal with them. Okay. So in the future, if you're ever doing an analysis of a passage with Roman numerals, if you end up thinking that a chord is a 3-6 or a 6-6, you're probably going to be wrong. You should relook at the notes again to get something else. Yes?
Could you play an example of either of those?
Sure, I can. Let's stay in the same key of D major. Can I play these examples? Okay, so a 3-6 chord is going to sound like this. And a 6-6 chord is going to sound like this. Now, out of context, in other words, not moving from one chord to another, it's kind of hard to gauge, but we'll find out next semester especially the 3 chord. It doesn't really even have an official function in music. And it doesn't really fit with the other chords in terms of possessing a strong behavior relating to chords that come before it and chords that come after it. So the 3/6 is especially no good. The 6/6, you'll probably see a 6 chord in first inversion. Maybe when you get to theory 3, you may see a few of them there. But for now, you don't even need to be concerned with that. And I think that's a good thing, right? We've got enough information we have to remember, right? If I'm telling you to just ignore a few things, let's do it. Okay. All of these other chords, though, that are not circled in red, X'd out in red, all of these other chords can be used in first inversion freely. And I want you to feel comfortable not only analyzing other chords in first inversion, but also part writing these chords in first inversion. And over the next several classes, we will get to learn how to part write all of these first inversion chords. One main point I want to make before I leave this is as follows. All of these first inversion chords that are not encircled in red here can be substituted for their root position counterparts. Okay, so for instance, if you wrote a progression that went something like 1, 2, 5, 1, and I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, we'll do this next semester, but you could feel free to substitute the first inversions of any of these chords. So you could change the progression to be 1, 6, 2, 6, 5, and 1 if you wanted. You can exchange root position and first inversion triads freely, except for this one and this one. All right. I think that might be all I wanted to say about the 3/6 and the 6/6 and just the first inversion triads in general. I'm going to give you a handout that should hopefully be a good reference for you to help you remember which chords you can use in which bass position and which triads you should not use in which bass positions. So let's just take a minute or so to look at this handout, and then we'll move on from there once I explain it. Now, the title of this handout says Triads and Inversions, a List of Useful Harmonies. In fact, I could probably put it up on the screen. Zoom out at least so I can see most of the information on here. All right. Across the top, in other words, the top, basically the top row. Don't include the row of all the headings. But in the top row, it says that it's labeled common chords off to the left. I want you to see along this top row that's all in white, I want you to know that you should feel free to write and to part write and to use and to analyze any of these chords in any of these inversions along the top white row. Okay? So all these root position triads feel free to use, all these first inversion triads feel free to use, and this one second inversion triad that I talked to you about last class, the tonic 6/4 or the 1/6/4 chord, please feel free to use. Those are common chords. We find them and encounter them regularly in music. The middle row is shaded in gray. These are uncommon chords. It means that they are chords that you could still use, although we won't be using them right now. But they're less frequent than the ones in the top white row. In fact, it says here, we will learn more about these uncommon chords soon. Do not use these chords yet. So in other words, you don't need to be writing 3 chords, even in root position, and certainly not in first inversion. Where are those? Oh, those are down. Those are down in the following row. So any chord in the gray row, it's not an illegal chord by any means, but I just don't want you using them yet because we just don't know how to use them properly. And then finally, the bottom row that's all shaded in dark, these are chords that you should not use. So do not use root position diminished triads. Not for now until we'll learn why we don't in a little bit. Probably next class we'll learn why we don't do that. Don't use 3 chord in first inversion, as I said. Don't use any 6/4 chords except for the 1/6/4 that's up here in the white row. And then I tried to add this in pencil. I hope it came out on your copy. 1/7. Don't analyze any 1/7 for now. 1/7 tend to be something else. At the end of Theory 2, we learned that they're mostly they're what's called secondary dominants. And if they're not secondary dominants, there's probably a way that you could analyze one of their pitches as a non-chord tone rather than calling them 1/7. True 7th chords on scale degree 1 are possible, but they generally appear only in the 20th and 21st century music or in jazz music, time periods of music and styles that we're not focusing on right now. So does anyone have any questions about this? I'll just let you hang on to this handout. Use it as a reference when you need to. When you're doing your homework, if you want to double check that and say, hey, can I write this chord? Or should I be analyzing the chord in this inversion? Well, just check this handout here. And if it's in the gray or the black row, then probably not. Probably not. Okay. Now, I'm going to, out of all these first inversion chords here listed in blue, I'm only going to be talking about 2 of them today. When we learn how to part write chords in first inversion, the doubling rules are unique, or they change, and they're different for almost every first inversion chord. Almost. So rather than throw all of these first inversion chords at you at once, like the 1, 2, 4, 5, 7 first inversion chords, rather than do that all at once, I kind of break it down and I give you either 2 or take 2 or 1 at a time. Because the doubling rules are different for some of these. So today, you can probably tell by looking at this, I want to explain to you how to part write and what the correct doubling is for the tonic chord in first inversion and for the dominant chord in first inversion. Just these 2. That is the 1/6 and the 5/6. The 1/6 and the 5/6. Those 2 first inversion chords we'll be focusing on right now, and then they'll be focused on the homework and so on. So the same doubling rule applies to both. You might say, well, why, Dr. Hawkinson, why did you just choose these 2 to talk about today rather than some others? Well, these 2 actually, they have the same doubling rule. You're supposed to, whatever you double in one of these chords, you double in the other and vice versa. And the rule is the same for both. And this is the doubling rule for both of these chords. Basically, it says double any note of the chord you want except for the bass note, the pitch that's in the bass. So a lot of our, well, basically all of our doubling rules that I've been talking about lately have been phrased in a positive way. In other words, for root position chords, I would say double the bass note. I tell you exactly what to double. And in second inversion triads, I say double the bass note, double this pitch. But this is the first doubling rule that I kind of present to you in a negative way. And by that, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. It just means that it's phrased with an exception or a not in it. So basically, I'm saying double any note you want except for the bass. Or you could think of it as, the doubling rule for these 2 chords, you could think of it as don't double the bass note. So don't do this. And then you could do whatever else is left over, any other note in the chord. So it's kind of, if you want to think of it in just a negative phrase, not as something negative like, oh, woe is me, now I have to learn this new doubling rule for these chords and it's a sour sounding one. No, it's not that, it's just a phrase in a negative way. Don't double the bass note. All right, now, the question might become, at this point, well, why on earth don't we want to double the bass note in a 1/6? And the best explanation for that, or the answer for that I can give you, is that in the 1/6 chord, most composers of the tonal style back in the day, they chose not to double the bass for the purposes of chord coloring, because they wanted a specific desired sound, desired sonority. They wanted a precise chord sound, and they didn't really care for the sound of when the bass note was doubled in this chord as much as when another chord tone was doubled. So it goes a little bit beyond, it goes beyond the scope of this class. But just for now, just assume that we don't want to double the bass in the 1/6 chord, and the reason is for basically chord coloring and specific desired chord sounds that composers used back in centuries ago in the tonal style. All right? Now, I hope that you could maybe figure out why. There's a much clearer reason why we never double the bass in a 5/6 chord. And let me see if I can put a crude example up on the board. Let's say I'm in the key of F major, and I've got a tonic chord, F, A, C, and then I have a 5/6 chord, that is one of these, and that's going to be E, C, G, and we'll talk about the doubling in a second. And then I go back to one chord, which is F, A, C. You know what, in fact, I'm gonna revoice this a little bit. G, C, A, C, F. Okay, now, I suppose I could, well, because I've got the staff already taken up by something else I want to do in a few moments, that's why I'm doing it this way, outside of the staff. Okay, who can tell me the bass note of a 5 chord in first inversion, what scale degree of the key is that? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7? Scale degree 7. The bass note of a 5 chord when it's in first inversion is always going to be scale degree 7. Always going to be scale degree 7. Do we have any rules about that high maintenance pitch scale degree 7? Have we talked about that a little bit before? I think we have. Yeah. For instance, on your yellow rule sheet, rule 3 is about scale degree 7. Rule 4 is about scale degree 7. In fact, rule 4 says the leading tone of the key, or T, that's my hand symbol for that in aural skills. The leading tone of the key must never, ever be doubled in any chord, especially the 5/6. That's probably one of the only chords that will have it appear in. Now, why should I not double T of the key, or scale degree 7? In fact, let's pretend that I did double it. Let's put another E in this chord. What is the rule about when the leading tone, scale degree 7, where T is found in an outer voice? Do you remember what we have to do with that pitch? Yeah, we have to actually move it up a half step so it goes to do. And that is actually rule 3 on your yellow sheet. If T, the leading tone of the scale, if it's in an outer voice, then as it goes to the next chord, it has to move up by a half step so it gets to do. Well, if T is in an outer voice, in this case, the soprano, and it's also going to be in an outer voice if it's in a 5/6 chord, then where does this E have to go also? It has to go up, right?
It has to be raised a step or a half step?
By a half step. By a half step. I know this isn't on a staff, musical staff, but what have I just written here? E in the soprano going to F, and E in the bass going to F.
Perfect octave?
Yeah, I'm right. I have written parallel octaves. Are we allowed to write parallel octaves in part rating? No. That's the first rule on the yellow sheet. Okay? So since we're not allowed to write parallel octaves, if you were to double the leading tone of the scale, or T, if you were to double it, especially if it's in an outer voice like the soprano, and it's also in the bass, you would have to write parallel octaves according to another rule. And we can't do that either. So rather than get yourself cornered like that, what I do is I say, well, just don't double the bass note of a 5/6 chord ever. And then you won't ever be tempted to or be forced to write parallel octaves by taking the leading tone up in multiple voices. You double another chord tone, whether it's G or C in this case, just pick another one, but not the note that's in the bass for a 5/6. So, again, the point is, the main reason we don't double the bass in a 5/6 chord is because the bass note will always be scaled to bass 7. And if you double it, especially if it's in another outer voice in addition to the bass, you'll be forced to write parallel octaves, and we can't have that. So, in order for you to just steer clear and to stay away of that terrible part writing pitfall, we're going to say never double the bass note in a 5/6, so you won't even be tempted to do that. You won't have the opportunity or the chance to make those errors. All right, so I think that's all I really want to say about the doubling rule for 1/6 and 5/6. You can double any pitch in the chord, but just not the pitch that's in the bass. And so what I want to do is, in the time we have left, I don't know if we'll have, well, we might have almost time. I want us to do a little bit of part writing, and if we don't finish this example, that's fine. But I at least want to get through this chord, and I want to get through this chord, to show you how to part write when you have root position and first inversion chords. Okay? Now, one thing I want to mention to you, and this is a very big piece of advice, and I highly recommend this. When you're given a part writing example with just the bass, and you have to do the top, fill in the top 3 voices, my high recommendation is that you write in the soprano notes or the soprano line first. And then after you're done with that line, then come back to the beginning and fill in the inner voices according to good part writing rules. Part of the reason for doing the soprano voice first is because if you isolate the soprano voice and you write the notes that belong in these chords, you'll be able to check much easier if the notes you're writing in the soprano are creating parallel octaves or fifths as you go along. Because we want to keep our soprano obviously free from parallel octaves and fifths with the bass. Another reason for putting the soprano line in first is if you have the soprano in the bass, you have the outer voices, and you have basically a good, correct framework or skeleton from which to work from, that you can go back and fill in the inner voices, and then the inner voices are actually easier to do when you have your boundary and your soprano and your bass for every chord. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have us fill in the soprano first, make sure it's free from parallel octaves or fifths with the bass, and then we'll go back to the inner voices and fill those in, the alto and the tenor. Okay? So here are some of the notes in these chords. We can understand that this 5 chord in B flat major contains the pitches F, A, C. Which pitch do I absolutely not want to write in the soprano? Based on the doubling what we just done. An A, that's right. Don't double the bass note. Don't put another A in any of the voices, because then it would be doubled. And can you see why? Look at if I doubled the A in the soprano. You see how I just written parallel octaves? Oof, nasty. Absolutely not. You don't want to have problems in your part writing already in the first measure. So let's pick another pitch, the F or the C. Which one would be closest to the soprano's B flat, an F or a C? The C, yeah. So we'll choose that. I'll choose that one for my soprano note. This chord is B flat D F. So it's not going to create any parallel fifths or octaves, so I can choose a D. It's creating parallel thirds with the bass, but parallel thirds are fine. This one's 1/6 B flat D F. Which pitch do I not want to double? The D, right? So I do not want to keep the D in the soprano because then I have the bass doubled. So I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to pick another chord tone. I'll take it back down to the B flat. Then I won't have the bass doubled. This chord is E flat, G, B flat. So There's nothing wrong with just keeping the B flat here since B flat fits into this chord. And this is an FAC chord, so I could take it down to the A. And last but not least, based on the key that I'm in, B flat major, where does this soprano A have to go for the last measure? There's only one choice for it. Does it go up to a B flat or does it go down to an F? It's got to go up to a B flat. You know why? Because A is scale degree 7 in this key. And it's in an outer voice. It's in the soprano. Whenever scale degree 7 is in an outer voice, it has to go up by half step. So that's the last note for the soprano must be B flat. It's its only option. All right, let's do a few of these chords for their inner voices. Now at this point, the part writing becomes a little more free. And I'm not saying that you should just feel free to do whatever you want. I'm just saying that there's not necessarily a strict guideline or a specific guideline that you need to follow in order to take the notes from one chord to the next. Basically, the information that we're going to be using to get the notes from one chord to the next are this. Number one, we know what we should double or what we shouldn't double. Number two, we're going to find the nearest chord tone to these pitches so that these pitches don't have to leap so far, but rather we want them to be able to move by step, by a small leap of a third, or maybe they don't have to move at all. They can stay static. Okay? So the combination now of keeping the voices from jumping too far and also knowing what notes we need and what doubling we need, those two things put together are going to help us decide how we fill in the inner voices. And that's kind of what part writing is starting to become now, as we get all these different inverted chords. So, let's just go through a few of these. I won't finish the whole thing, but we already said, what are we not supposed to double in the 5-6?
The bass chord.
The bass, so no A. Okay? That means I could double the F if I wanted to, or I could double the C. Well, it just matters what proximity do we have our inner voices. Look at the altos on an F. Do I have to move that at all? No, because I need an F in the chord. So I'm just going to leave the altos F where it is and not have to move it. That's ultra speed. And then I can double the F or the C but not the A. Which one do you think is closest to the tenor's D? Is it a C or is it an F? Pretend you're a tenor and you're singing the D. Which note is closer, a C or an F? A C. So I'm going to put the tenor on a C, because that's closest. And see, now I've got all the notes I need and I have not doubled the A in the bass. But I've decided on doubling the C because of where these notes were in the prior chord. They're close proximity to these. That's why I chose them. B flat, D, F. We know we need to have the root of this chord, the bass note, the B flat, doubled. Which one, the alto or the tenor, is closer to a B flat? Yeah. So let's give the tenor the B flat. And then what pitch do we still need in this chord? Looks like an F. Right, B flat, D, F. We have a D. Hey, look at that. The alto doesn't have to move at all. And when voices or pitches aren't moving, if they're remaining static, there's absolutely no chance for parallel fifths or octaves. Because their motion is static, not parallel. Right? Okay, let's do one more. Let's finish up with the 1-6. What am I not supposed to double in a 1-6? The bass. So I do not want another D in this chord. One D in the bass is enough. But it's still a B flat D F chord. So that means I need to add some B flats or some Fs or one of each or something like that. This couldn't be simpler, right? Take a look. Where is the alto pitch on? It's on an F, right? Don't I need an F in the next chord? So let's just keep it where it is. And am I allowed to double? I'm allowed to double either the F or the B flat. Well, where am I coming from in the tenor? A B flat? Do I have to move it at all? No. I can double the B flat. Because it's not doubling the D. And so, again, based on knowing what I need to double or what I shouldn't double, knowing where my inner voices are in the prior chord, and knowing that I don't want to have to move them or especially have them lead too far, that helps me decide on where to put the inner voices for the remaining chords. That's kind of how part writing, the freedom of real true part writing starts to come out. Okay? So I won't go any further, but I hope you can kind of see why and where I picked these inner voices, and based on the doubling and their close proximity to the chord tones that I needed in the following chord. So, with that said, since I'm running out of time, your next assignment for Wednesday is out of the workbook. It's on page 63, and it's only selected exercises. Don't do the whole page, because that might take you multiple hours. On page 63, I'm asking you to fill in the inner voices, the alto and tenor, for numbers 4, 8, 10, and 11. Number 4, number 8, number 10, and 11 only. And the reason I chose those is because these examples have 5/6 chords and 1/6 chords in them. The other examples on the page have other first inversion triads that I didn't teach you how to part right yet. So just those 4. 4, 8, 10, and 11 for Wednesday. Okay? And that's all the time we have for today, so thanks.